Wow, that's a very thorough presentation that I am also impressed. Thank you very much for Katya. So first, I'd like to thank the wonderful people at Garage who gave me this wonderful opportunity to speak to you today, especially Ekaterina Inosentseva, of course, I'm pronouncing correctly, and of course, Anton Belov, and Elizaveta Kachuskeva, Belly, and Anna Mihailenko, who's here today, who helped me. And of course, but she's an architect, Ekaterina Golovichuk, who is my colleague at OMA and AMO. So today, well, it's going to be very architectural. I'd like to know how many of you have architectural background? Okay, maybe less than 10%. Okay. So for the rest of you, I'd like you to become a fan of architecture after this lecture. But anyway, so first of all, I'm going to show you some striking houses that were recently built in Japan. I don't know if this really makes sense to you because in Moscow, you have most of the buildings are huge. And I hardly see any small individual house. But in Japan, house is a very important typology of architecture. Anyway. So here, this is Go Hasegawa, one of the emerging star of architect in Japan. It's a house in Tokyo built 6 years ago. And it's a very peculiar house with this the sense of tradition, but also ultra-modern. So this is how actually people live in this house. Very, very tiny, but very experimental. And this is more famous building by Ryo Nishizawa. It's a Moriyama house. It's already 12 years ago, and it's a very outstanding work. And it's a rather a very sensational work in the world of architecture. So seemingly, it's a random composition of boxes. It looks random, but everything is carefully positioned, especially for organizing sight lines from each window. And it's another small house by Kazuo Sejima, who also works in this country right now, I think. It's a house in a plum grove already 14 years ago. And it's an extremely small house, but the maximum spaciousness is sought through ultra-thin walls and audacious openings. And this is a very especially striking house designed by So Fujimoto in Tokyo. And it's a literal experiment with the ordinary-looking houses. So the Japanese architecture has constantly been renewed with new generations. Especially house has been a very busy building typology, as young ones always come up with new ideas and attempts. So surely these houses try out innovative ideas, but I say that they're very fortunate ones because their clients were super understanding, very lucky ones. And they present very sophisticated form of architecture. So I have to say that looking about the history since after the World War II, house seems to have been not only an arena for architectural experimentation, but also an index of varying degrees of social engagement. It's interesting to see that architects from generation to generation kind of sway between the two poles. So one is self-sufficient universe in itself, but the other one is completely different. It's a social engagement, more open connection to the society. And they struggled in dilemma. Now, perhaps you have heard of the architect called Shigeru Ban, who also worked for Garage for the temporary exhibition space. And this is a housework designed by Shigeru Ban, already 17 years ago. It's a house in the countryside, but it's rather than a design, but it's a model. And it is a statement or presentation or proposal for him to the society that a house can be made almost automatically by organizing industrial materials, like Charles and Ray Eames did in the 50s and 60s. It's called Naked House. So you can see here. So it's the same house, but then with the manipulation of furniture, you can change the use and ambience of living in this house. It's a very beautiful house. Or another one, this is a work by Sejima, more recent work, and is a manifestation of a new relationship with the context that is the traditional, but also generic. But I think that she's looking at the larger picture than before. It's a house at the edge of Kyoto City. So this is, anyway, I'd like you to know, to see how architects kind of envision the life in the future as a kind of a social statement rather than an individual one when designing a house in relationship with the city, and just how Japanese architecture struggle in dilemma between architectural expression or reality. So chapter 1 is about house. So this is the ground zero where it all began. This is the photograph taken right after the end of the Second World War, and it's Tokyo seen from the sky. And so Tokyo actually started with a tabula rasa condition after massive air raids. And now it is how it is today, after 72 years from the tabula rasa. The city has an intensely dense skyline. Population leaped and converged into the city, and it worked as a very flexible platform for high economic growth, where technological development and construction investment concentrated and accelerated. But meanwhile, in between these 72 years, in the shadows of the city skyline were architects, of course, and architects with big offices, but also small offices, trying to develop their own identity and ideas in the process of modernization. So they're in between kind of modernization brought from the Western sphere of the world, but also trying to seek their own Japanese identity at the same time. So this is a big dilemma. And so the architects with the small houses especially try to address the needs, but also the dreams of people with tiny particles of houses. Here in the post-war and high economic growth periods, they had a different stance to the city from the contemporary ones. So here you see, this is the whole history of Japan's population, starting from the year 800 to a bit looking further into 21st year. And then the pink area is the area that I'm talking about today, the period between after the Second World War and now. So you see this is a population, but also similar to the graph of the economic growth. And I think that it's probably kind of similar to the USSR and Russia, but it's look at how steep the graph is from World War II ends and now. And by the way, the Takashi Murakami was born in the middle, also in the process of like still this high kind of leaping period. But then today we already hit the top, the peak. And the situation is very different because now the curve is beginning to go downwards, quite the opposite of the last 50 years of the second half of the 20th century. So this is the new construction amount of new construction houses. This again, that is similar up curve, very steep. So like the American West Coast architects in the 1950s, Japanese architects also tried to quickly industrialize housing in Japan because there was the urgency to meet the demands of the leaping population. And so this is the first house proposed by the Kiyoshi Ikebe It's called Solid Minimum House, 5 years after the war. And then this one is a bit more stylized with incorporating the Japanese kind of, well, I would say the design language into this industrialized product. So after the war, what architects had in mind was a sense of mission to build a system of housing rather than the house itself. So what is not so common is that the members of Metabolism, the visionary architecture movement in the late 50s to the early 70s, let's say, were also committed to developing a system of housing besides making a visionary ideas of a city. And here comes a link to Russia, or back then the USSR. So this is a picture from Moscow, 1958. Kishore Kurokawa, one of the Metabolism architects, was sent to the USSR in 1958 during the Khrushchev thaw period to attend the UIA Congress in Moscow and also the Conference of Architecture Students in St. Petersburg. Later, he wrote in a book that the mind-boggling experience in this trip was to visit the housing prefabrication lines in St. Petersburg, which were far more advanced than in Japan. So this is the conference that he took of Moscow. And so the left young boy is the Kishore Kurokawa, and with his camera, and so with this camera he took also a bunch of photographs of the housing factory that he visited in St. Petersburg. Unfortunately, I don't have the picture. I know that they're in the National Library of Japan. So he wrote this book in 1964 as one of the first books on prefabricated house in Japan. So he was, and by the way, very, very sympathetic to the ideas of the socialist realism throughout his life. So this is the box-type prefabricated apartment houses he made. It's a project in 1962. And apparently, this was a prelude to this very famous building in Tokyo that still exists called Nakagin Capsule Tower. It's many, 144 capsules attached to two big cores of elevators and staircases. And the idea is to plug in and plug out each capsule whenever it is old. Ironically, it is too old, and so you can renew it with the new ones. But ironically, no capsule has ever been replaced. And now the entire building is slugging, and then we have a discussion of whether tearing the whole building down or preserving it as a historical building. And another one, this is done by Kikutake, another member of Metabolism, and who conceived this futuristic marine city project, the city floating on the sea, in 1958, and made serious efforts in developing prefabricated units of kitchen, bath, and toilet that are replaceable parts of a house. And he actually applied it to the Pacific. So this is the one he actually made to test as the one-to-one model in the factory. And he applied it to this hotel that was built in 1964, the last Olympic Games in Tokyo. And this is not so known, totally, I think, neglected in the history of Japanese architects, because Metabolism is known as a futuristic city proposal. But actually, they were very, very seriously engaged with how to actually change the city, and they started with working on the tiniest member of a house. That was very, I think, socially oriented engagement. So this person is called, his name is Kazuo Shinohara. He comes into the scene as one of the main protagonists of the lecture today, because he's been one of the most influential figure in the contemporary Japanese architecture. So he brought in a totally different approach for social contribution. He studied for quite a long time the traditional folklore architecture in Japan in order to modernize, to understand and propose how it can be changed into a modern city. Kazuo Shinohara sought a contemporary prototype of Japanese house in a more sophisticated and aesthetic manner than metabolists. So, for instance, take a look at this beautiful house, I think. It's called Umbrella House. Why called umbrella? Because of this. Inside, it is a very simple structure of a house, looking like the inside of under the umbrella, and using timber materials. And so he was, he was pursuing this affordability, applicability, and practicality for people, for anyone, by reinterpreting the traditional codes of Japanese housing in an aesthetic manner. And this is still remained as an icon in the Japanese contemporary architecture history. So this is how the living room looked. And as the housing industry quickly developed, I think Shinohara also felt the urgency that architects need to establish their social position. And I'd like to know how it was in this country at the same time. So he continued to seek the fundamental of housing architecture with the house with an earthen floor. Again, is a reference to the traditional Japanese folklore house in 1963. And also another iconic work of house, which is called House in White. So every architecture students try to visit this house to be inspired. So Shinohara is the first protagonist of this lecture, but I believe, there's a very famous saying that that a house must be beautiful and space must allow sounds to echo back and forth. So you have to have a very kind of tangible and sensible experience in a house, both through the eyes and through the senses. And he also said, I believe a beautiful house is more valuable than the house that is just practical or convenient, but that is not beautiful. So he believed in this beauty, aestheticism of a house. So the question is, did Shinohara actually give such a big influence to the society of architecture or the society at large? Well, let's take a quick look at the changes in the city in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. Okay. So this is a picture of Kenzo Tange. He is called the kind of father of the modern architecture in Japan, but he was also an urban planner. He proposed to Tokyo, this is how the city should be. Tokyo is actually to the north of the bay, but he proposed this whole new city floating on the sea, and he was really, really serious. He tried to make it happen for 2 or 3 years, but he failed. But the Olympic came in 1964, and he was given this commission to design this very famous national gymnasium in the center of Tokyo. But ironically, in the meantime, this Olympic gave momentum for big corporation of general contractors, construction companies, who can also design buildings, and also large corporate design firms. So I give you some beautiful examples. Palace Side building, which is still standing today as beautiful as it is, next to the Imperial Palace of Tokyo. And this was designed by a big corporate design firm, the biggest today. And this is a very impressive work of urban architecture, and which takes a very different approach than a house. And it accommodates a city within the building itself. You see, so this is how this inside looks like. But compared to Russian architecture also, this is a much smaller example. But many intricate ideas and experiments in design within the city, also proposing how people should live in the architecture, in the big buildings in the city. And this is a scene from TV program last year, and that was shot on the rooftop of the building. Or this is the first skyscraper in Tokyo, another design, big corporate design firm in 1967. Now, then this, well, all in all, these big buildings were making ways to the future, which was hugely celebrated by the Expo 70 in Osaka. Maybe you know this also. So I don't know how many, I think more than 5 million people visited this event from Japan, but also from the world. And USSR had one of the biggest pavilions here. Now, I wanted to show this film by Andrei Tarkovsky. If someone was sleeping, but nobody is sleeping, so I will just show this image. Now, so this is the second protagonist of the lecture today, Arata Isozaki. He was, and still is, a very important figure in Japanese architecture, but also art, contemporary art. He had a similar aspiration and mission to Shinohara's in terms of that city, in terms of the social engagement for architects. But he was more focused on the city instead of house. And designing buildings for public use, Isozaki tried to present new modes of urban life, like the architecture of in the city that I showed before. So this is the Ota Medical Hall from 1960 and 72, in which you can see this. It's such an old time, but then you already see this very drastic composition of space in terms of transparency, and then the spaciousness that was very unusual in the building modes back then. And this is a bank headquarters in a provincial city in Japan. And again, using kind of mirror wall and very stylized chair and openness and marble. These are all unusual kind of modes or elements of architecture that you would see in a bank. But he tried to revolutionize that, and also incorporating the art by the San Francis, and then the other works of the contemporary art back then into this executive room of a bank. So that was also quite radical, I think. So now that was the city in contrast to the house. Now, something dramatic happens now. Our third protagonist of the lecture today is Toyo Ito, who is today still a leading architect in our country. So Ito worked for Kikutake. If you remember, he was one of the Metabolism architects who made this visionary city floating on the sea, which is this one. And actually, he interpreted this image of the marine city from 1950s to the Expo 1970 as a reality. And Toyo Ito was one of the architects who worked on the project. But alongside this expo, he also worked on this MoveNet kind of furniture. And I think for architect back then to work on a furniture is a kind of intimidating experience, I think, but he did, because they believed in this importance of making changes to the distribution or economic system and construction system. So what he worked was this FRP made the kitchen unit and also bath and toilet unit. But he wrote later that while he was designing and trying to make it more and more beautiful, he also knew that a big company of, maybe you've heard of the company called Toto. They were also developing the similar, or actually the same system of toilet and bath for the Tokyo Olympics and also Expo 70. And this is the Toto's work. And more he felt that it is useless to make it beautiful. And then, for anyone, more practical, more convenient is more important than beautiful. So he felt defeated. Now, this is a house also entirely prefabricated in a factory. So the Russian the learning came true in Japan, maybe 10 years later, or more than 10 years later. So the disappointment led him to question the meaning of being an architect at all, and then become more distorted and introverted as an architect. And in his own words, the frustration was inflated under the influence of Shinohara's. So this, the tractor can pick up and then just bring it and just place it on the site, and it's done in 3 days. It was true. So this was made by a chemical company who used to be making kind of buckets, plastic buckets, and then quickly, suddenly started to make this house, and it was a big boom. Then, 2 years later, Kishio Kurokawa, the metabolist, also, after the work of working on capsules or the prefabricated units, hugely inspired by his learning in Russia, or USSR, he made also this Capsule Tower come true. So this complication of Toyo Ito continues. So upon setting up his own office, Ito publishes a few prototypes, projects in a popular architecture magazine in 1972. At the time, the editor, a guest editor for this magazine was Arata Isozaki, and one of them, this is the drawing of a house that I'll show you later. So one of them was called Urbot 003. Urbot is a combination of urban robot and Tokyo, and then the subtitle was Tokyo Vernacularism. And this was his response to metabolism. So he respected metabolism, but also he had a strong reaction, a negative reaction to metabolism at the same time. So it's half parody, but also half serious. And he even built this idea with the aluminum house, but it was for his sister. So that was possible. Or another extreme case was, this is a house by Montamozuna. It's called Anti-Dwelling Box. So he named this house like it's against living. It makes it very complicated to live in this house. But this was a house made for his own mother. So it was a statement, and kind of aggressive bad boy statement. And it's a perfect cube, which was broken into living room and other household functions. This is also a very beautiful house by Kazuo Shinohara called Tanikawa House in 1974. And he introduced earthen floor, like mud floor, inside a house. It's an artistic statement, but it was okay because the client was a poet. He understands it. And so he really enjoyed this direct contact with the nature. Maybe you have heard of the architect called Tadao Ando. He is a very famous architect in Japan. It's a row house in Sumiyoshi. This house made him very famous. And he tried to reinvent the vernacular row house in Osaka with an aggressively modern and aesthetic manner. But so this is how it is in a house. It feels almost not a house inside. But anyway, it's beautiful. And then this is a house by Toyo Ito himself. And this was, as I will explain it, this was a very important work for Toyo Ito because it became a kind of benchmark for a complete turn, kind of a U-turn, like this U shape of a house, but also a U-turn in the direction of an architect. So inside the house, this is a house. Of course, later it was filled with furniture, but you see what he tried to do in this house. It's an interplay, the very kind of subtle interplay of light, the artificial light and natural light, and also the space itself. So it's almost a space for Zen or meditation rather than living. But it is beautiful. And then this house is in Tokyo also a brutal combination of geometric forms in bare concrete, both inside and also outside. So it's meant to be a kind of funny, like it's a very kind of humorous form, but also a result of a very strict calculation of geometry in architecture. And this is how it was, and this makes me feel a bit kind of relieved. But also the brutal combination, the structure, also made in bare concrete, that still architects worship this space for the beauty. So comes in our second protagonist, Arata Isozaki, again. So he challenged these architects with this big question mark. But hey, guys, can house be a fundamental issue of architecture after all? He actually said, well, you guys are so proud of the houses that you design, but then I would not call you an architect because you're not working on anything else. So everybody was very, very frustrated and were humiliated. But now I can understand that what he meant was that the architect should be dealing with a larger picture rather than focused on the tiny situation. And instead, the architect should participate in shaping the future of the city, or the whole of the city, which was in need in Japan back then. So this photograph taken by Koji Taki, who was a very influential photographer and thinker, I think exemplifies this question by Isozaki. So you see, a house is completely closed against the context. It is an introverted work of a hermetic approach of the architect in 1976. So it became, it came to cause a growing controversy about this house, pro or con. Now, this new chapter, a new era begins because of the oil shock. Now, the whole movement is swayed into this new way of oil shock and economic, the situation of economic condition, climate. So the economic boom and construction hype towards the Expo 70 caused a serious inflation. The event also accelerated the polarization of capital and power. General contractors and corporate design firms even became more serious and reinforced their position in the market, while architects with small houses, offices had trouble even finding work to survive. So the left down curve reaches the bottom of there with Osaka Expo is the big inflation, but 4 years later is a more global situation hits Japan also, which was the oil shock. And so that was the really kind of devastating to architects. So then, contrary to being introverted, the architects of the young generation began to reconnect with the real world out of necessity, out of desperation, and so but in a rather surprising ways. So I think it's fair to see the series of actions as attempts to transcend modernism. So in a way, I would call what I'm going to show you now is the postmodernism in Japan, which is not about Roman columns or pedestals in America or Europe. So you see, this is the housing, the construction also reflects the economic crisis. So 1973, it just drops dramatically. And then later on, it will catch us up slowly. But this was the moment of crisis for architects. So the first story is about Osamu Yoshiyama. He was an architect, and he continued to be an architect, but he also became a trader of lumber or wooden material for building houses from America in 1973 as a way to revolutionize the affordability of a house and liberate everyone to be able to buy a house. He also designed ready-made house using the lumber he imported. Another architect, Hiroshi Hara, begins his world journey through India to Arabian countries to North Africa to the Southern Africa to research about vernacular settlements from 1973 until the end of the 70s. And his reports are immediately published in magazines, and that are absorbed by himself, but also by other architects like Riken Yamamoto. So this is the note that he made during the journey. I think it was Yemen. And then this was an example of this influence of this world journey by Riken Yamamoto, 1977. This peculiar-looking house is a house. It's a very proper house. It's a beautiful house, actually. And so this house by Osamu Ishiyama, who became the trader of lumber or timber, was a radical attempt to make a house entirely out of industrial materials. So this is the beautiful drawing that he made, and showing each piece that you can make a house with. Then again, Toyo Ito makes a turn. He started this research group on house as a commodity in the market. He was, you see, if you remember, he was against the urban condition or society, the market economy itself, but he switches to reintegrate, to reconnect to the market system again in 1982. So this group also included Kazuo Sejima. She was very young at the time, the starter, to use, and the idea was to use industrial materials as much as possible in a house that is still beautiful and theoretically robust, and that is also competitive in the market. And actually, the idea was built like this. And he was so happy, and he started to appear in video, try to show this house by himself. And this is a very cute Kazuo Sejima-san. Now, the architect who became the trader of lumber, the timber material, the Osamu Ishiyama, studied also this, what he called DD system, is a direct dealing system, that the idea was to, he, as an architect, design building materials for a house and make the distribution network with architects and builders, and actually make a house with them. Now, I'm going to show you this link, I think a very rare link between architecture and art, contemporary art. This is, maybe Katya, you know this. This is the art performance by High Red Center with 3 members, including Genpei Akasugawa in 1964. It was a parody of performance, the artists performing cleaners, cleaning the streets of the main street in Japan called Ginza, in the pure white gown, the laboratory gowns. So he came up as a very avant-garde artist at the time, and it was a protest against the Olympic boom in 1964. The same guy. So the guy with the microphone is Akasugawa. And then the guy sitting with glasses in the center is Terunobu Fujimori. He was a historian at the time. And then together with other members, like a cartoonist. And then, so they all of a sudden made a press conference in Tokyo to proclaim that we're going to start this new movement on the street. So what they did was, so they were often on the street, tried to find the natural, how do you call that, this work of art in a particular kind that they discovered. So they hunted architecture without architects, or the surreal outcome of people's doing in a modern city or enjoy sharing the harvest. So they were on the street in the daytime, at the nighttime they gathered together in a room to show all the harvest on slides and make criticism, and then see who comes up with the best result. So they continued doing this for more than 10 years. And still sometimes they get back together and do it. So this is some of the harvests. So the most famous one is the pure staircase in Yotsuya. So of course these staircases were made as staircases in the beginning, but then for some reason, for some unknown reason, it was kind of shattered from the renewed part of a house, but somehow the staircases remained. So it's a pure staircase for no function. So, a creation with no function but also beautiful is a very good example of fine art, according to Akasegawa, or the other ones as well. So then they find that they suddenly discovered this in the city, and made a great hobby for many, many more people to follow. So now back to architects. Osamu Ishiyama again, the trader. And what he did was, as an experiment, to let the client build his own house without him being in the center, but having the client in the center of the construction. What he did was, he wrote hundreds of these sketches and drawings, and also letters. Well, this is a sketch, but also letters with text. To the client, he kept sending these materials so that he can, step by step, the client can build his own house, incorporating his own desires. So it's a really intense kind of integration between the architect and the client, and this is how it is today. Well, this is a photograph taken 3 years ago. And the guy, of course, is an old man now, but he's still very happy with his family. Very domesticated. Yes. So then Ito recalls, looking back at that period, it was in 1980 that I really began to be positive, reviewing what it was to design a house considering the urban context or thinking about lifestyle. So Shinohara and Isozaki, the two mentors who emerged in the 1960s, gave immense impact on the generations of the 1960s and through the 80s in two contrasting ways, in a kind of dialectics. And I think as a result, the two guys enabled these generations and thereafter to cultivate the soil of architectural culture on which the younger generation today, whose work I show you at the beginning of the lecture, and these two guys expanded the capacity or the ability of architecture itself. So that's why I show this whole process of the history to explain the undercurrent of the contemporary architecture in Japan. Now, I want to talk about what it is today. We are facing a new dilemma. Then Japan is put into a new situation again. The first thing is the bubble economy in the late 80s transformed the mood and liberty of architecture. Suddenly, architects were able to build any kind of his own dreams. But after the bubble burst in the early 1990s, architects were blamed for designing unnecessary or lavishly spending public buildings. And I think it's more or less universal in that part of the history in the world. But generally speaking, the Japanese architects lost social relevance, unfortunately. So here, you see, remember the oil shock in 1973, 74, and the bubble economy begins in the late 80s. And then it hits the peak, 1991, 1990, and then suddenly bursts, and to the shock of everyone. And then since then, Japan was in a long, long stagnation for more than 20 years. Now, finally, with this current regime, is finally beginning to pick up. So I also pointed where the super flood of Takashi Murakami is like, it's a kind of the moment of healing from this devastating, shocking crisis of Japan, and then comes in this global economy comes in and kind of slowly help Japanese economy or the mood to be more positive. Well, I have to show you some shocking images. Then came the great Kobe earthquake. This whole infrastructure, even this urban infrastructure, so huge and robust, seemingly robust, were useless. So obviously it gave a huge shock to architects who believed that they were part of the positively constructing the society. Then, yes, so after this, well, it really gave immense impact on the attitudes, the mentality of architecture, and new attitudes emerged among the profession. For instance, I would say that this work, which came out as a book called Made in Tokyo, it's a very interesting book made by at the Bow Wow. It's a unit of a couple architects, and who introduces their findings in the city, which became their source of inspiration. For instance, anonymous design, unplanned accumulation of people's doings or coincidences can create an amusing place or phenomenon of wonder by themselves without architect. Hey, we can step aside in our own ego of author and still have fun outside of it. That was the message. And I think in Japan, the book's impact could be compared to Robert Venturi's Las Vegas or this ROJO Society by the Akasegawa and Fujimori. So, well, actually, this is we are looking at the rooftop of car driving school, car driving technique school, and then that is used into another kind of urban surface for driving car. And then, so that is something that architects would not usually think about, or this, the rooftop of, well, the surface of the urban, the rooftop of this famous, the train and highway and train rows in the middle of Tokyo is not the roof. Okay, the highway has this the space underneath, and then the space in between the ground and highway is also utilized as shopping space. So what they did was that they spotted all these funny moments in the city, and showed the ideas in this very nice graphics to communicate with everyone, and even to the surprise or revelation of architects for the inspiration. But yet, the economic stagnation since the bubble burst lingered through the 2000s. So if you look at the bookstore, the architecture book section, then it was really kind of put you down. For instance, if you look at the title, Architects Who Can Survive, How to Live as an Architect, Architect Who Can Be Trusted, What Architects Can Do Now, Architecture for Survival, and Architect's Mission. So they're all questioning this fundamental kind of raison d'etre of architects, whether it's okay to be an architect or if you should change your job. It was really at the end of it, the extreme condition, I think. Then the Great Tohoku earthquake hit Japan in 2011, and again, it gave an immense, tremendous impact on the minds of architects. It was also shocking that all local governments went to think tanks or business consultants for recovery urban master plans, not to architects. In the past, architects were commissioned to do this kind of thing, but then by then, architects were not in the picture to be thought about as someone to trust, to ask this work, as this task to recover a city that was drawn by the waves, a tsunami. So it was like architects were replaced by big capitals. And another observation is that, well, sorry to be very negative, but what about, was that the buildings in the city, like even they were designed by famous architects like Metabolism or Kenzo Tange, well, after 13 years or 28 years, it's nothing, you know, for the longevity of a building, but they were replaced by yet a new buildings, most of the time very generic buildings. So, yes, so in other words, these the individual kind of masters of architect are out in the city at least, and then like anonymous big corporations are in as the main players, the people who are actually in the change, the working on the change of the city. So what about houses? Well, for all the struggles of Shinohara and thereafter, the majority of houses is in the hands of local carpenters, small design offices, or prefab housing manufacturers. So the left one, the house, is a traditional house. And this is, I would say, this variation of the house occupies still more than 50% of the houses in the entire country. And then this is a new version of kind of prefabricated house that is already kind of 16% of the whole market share. But that's not a serious problem compared to this. The real issue is that new condition of Tokyo and many other cities across the country, which is now shrinking. The shrinking kind of population decreases and also starts to age more and more, older and older. So you see, the year here is now already 2 years ago, but it's expected to hit the peak in 2020, and after that, Tokyo's population is going to decrease. And it's a new condition, the situation of Tokyo, and I'm showing this because I think it's not particular to Tokyo, but also this will be the situation that many, many more cities around the world, even in this country, will be facing. And so now we are kind of suddenly put into this situation of almost opposite condition of economy and urbanization, and now what? For architect was the question. So what it means, for instance, the working population in Tokyo will decrease. So how to sustain the city? I mean, of course, it means kind of reduction of tax income, reduction of productivity, reduction of even kind of mood, high spirit. It is really problematic. And also, also shocking fact or speculation is that the population of the aged people, but also living alone, one person alone without a family in a house, will be decreasing so much. Increasing so much. Right. So this map of Tokyo shows this clearly the coming crisis. The ring zone in red color, you see the center that is the Imperial Palace, and also is surrounded by business district and also surrounded by residential district, which is more or less in red color, is in need of urgent actions to mitigate the physical vulnerability against natural disasters, aging of a house, and also the increasing number of empty houses, like houses who no longer have people to live inside. But the central area here is the opposite. The purple zone must continue to pump in energy, new energy, by building more and more. So these are two opposite directions. So Tokyo, the city that remains economically sustainable, in order to sustainable, they need to deal with two opposite roadmaps at the same time. And that is the dilemma of Tokyo today. Now, as the new social condition unfolds, a few architects are being drawn to the countryside, the not urban areas now, and I see it as a phenomenon of post or super urbanism. Perhaps we could say that our long-lasting obsession with the city is maybe coming to an end, and behind the glory of star architects, they're also beginning to do something new. So the first example is Kazuo Sejima, who is working on the Inujima Island, which is a tiny, tiny island with a population of about 50 to 60, and mostly old ladies, older than 70 years old. So what to do with this the island? It was literally sinking. But Kazuo Sejima was kind of participant, yes? Yes. Yes, yes. So it's very few. And why this island is inhabited, well, has so many houses, many of them, by the way, are empty, of course. But it used to have a factory to produce chemicals during the Second World War. And also after that, it became a huge refuge place to bump the rubbishes from the city. Then everything, and then all these people left. After that, were remaining these less than 70 people on the island. And so this is the island that Sejima is working now. So, well, in the first phase, she was part of the program bringing artists to the island to create new installations, and that was a big success. And the second phase is to create to work on the landscape of the island. So this is one on the landscape design, which is the garden that everybody can work on every day. For instance, this public program is something that Sejima herself often participates in with the villagers and also tourists and many students actually of art and architecture. So through this series of programs, it instigates kind of lots of people coming in and out. Even if they don't stay on the island because there's no hotel on the island, they come in the day and participate and meet the islanders and participate in some kind of production, and then or exchange of ideas, or like exchanging recipes from with the old ladies on the island, and they return back home, and so that contributes to the economy of the island. That is the idea. Or the case of Toyo Ito, he's working on another island in the region, in the same region. And what he's doing is instigating new social activities and architecture projects also to revive energy on the island. So it all started with building a museum, a very tiny museum, but with this amazing view, looking over these ocean and islands. And it's very popular, but then he continued to settle on the island, and he even recently wrote this, a kind of master plan, sketching out ideas, what he could do together with the islanders. And he doesn't have to design all of these buildings, he's just making suggestions. And also he's very much involved in various programs. For instance, he is sometimes working with the high school students on the island to interview old islanders and to ask for what the life on the island was 50 years ago, and to make the record of the history, and then share this interview, this history, oral history, with the visitors, together with high school students. Or also he is teaching the children architecture on the island. And this is another case, which is at the Bawao, the architects unit. unit is working on Momonora fishing port. It's one of the fishing ports hit by the Tohoku tsunami in 2011, this big tsunami earthquake, as the master planners for new social programs to generate new economy and education. So they find education, especially educating young people how to do fishing as business, is very important for this village. So what they built is a device to enable and cause various forms of exchanges. So this is the house that they just built earlier this year. And it turns out to be very successful. And the last case is by young architects called Dot Architects, who made a complex of open kitchen and local radio station and a meeting facility. It's called Omaki Camp, which invites the local farmers to bring in vegetables that or meat that they cannot sell anymore, they don't have to sell, to this place and share it with visitors or and other members of the village, and then just as an alibi to make fun kind of meetings and exchanges. So now, neither house nor city. The countryside, or actually the shrinking, is now unfolding a new territory for architects, I think. They are sensing the need to respond to the social demand for creative solutions, and which is an important part, is that it is outside the market economy. So I feel that in 10 years from now, we're going to probably see another landscape of new architectural attempts in diverse social conditions in and outside of the city. Well, thank you very much.
Are there any questions? I will give you the microphone. Should I stand up? Hello. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. I would like to ask you one question and make two comments. In the first third part of the lecture, you showed photos of Osaka Expo 1970, and then you showed a film frame from Solaris by Tarkovsky. I do not know, but I'm interested in interaction between Russia and Japan in the area of film. I know that Tarkovsky wanted to film Osaka Expo when he wanted to film the city of the future, but he couldn't do it, so he filmed the Haneda Airport Road to the center instead, because he couldn't get visa on time. So since you mentioned Osaka Expo, you said that the pavilion of USSR had the biggest number of visitors, and it showed a lot of interest in Soviet culture. And today we have a lot of audience here at your lecture, so there is a lot of interest of Russian people in Japanese history and architecture. So are there any joint projects between Russian and Japanese architects? And if there aren't any, what kind of vision do you have in terms of collaboration between architects of our countries?
Thank you very much for a very inspiring question. I wish I could go back to the slide of the Expo 70. Maybe someone can help kind of switch back the slide. But first of all, yes, you're correct. So Tarkovsky, the Solaris, this is my great hero movie. I saw it more than 10 times. And but also I was always impressed by this scene, the very, very long scene. Did you see this film? Yeah, of course. There's a very long scene about, I think it goes on for a few minutes, which is quite long. And you can see through the center part of Tokyo, not only the airport, but also the very center of Tokyo, but always on the highway. And I don't know how he did it, because there are very few cars, which also make it very futuristic. I think that he did come to Tokyo to film, but he was, yes, but I didn't know that it was because of the visa problem. Now, the other collaboration between the USSR or Russia and Japan, as far as I know of it, another member of Metabolism, I mentioned that Kishore Kurokawa is a big supporter of the socialist realism and also Russian constructivism. But I went to meet another metabolist architect before he died, and he proudly showed me a Japanese book translated from Kropotkin's book, which was anarchist. And he was known to be a very sober and serious architect, but actually he was very anarchistic in mind, he said. So like I still, this is a very important book for me, he said. And so I think especially in the 1950s to 60s, people were very ardently read books written in Russia. Especially literature was always a very big kind of the reading, must read books. Everybody reads Dostoevsky and many other, and also theater was very much influenced by Russian theater. In terms of architecture and also linked to Expo. Thank you very much. Yes, there was this big USSR pavilion in this whole Expo site. But also, I should mention that, you see, there's this funny statue with the kind of sun face in the middle. So it has this big platform of steel bars. And that was actually meant as the floating city, inspired by the situationist architect in France and Europe back then in the 60s. And also, what is not so much known is that under the top part of the platform was actually hanging many different capsules. And some of the capsules were assigned to architects selected from different countries, including Archigram, the very popular architects from London at the time, but also Russian architect from the USSR. And his name was Alexei, and I forget his name, but he was invited also from the USSR. So I think that people, especially the Kenzo Tang and the Metabolists, wanted the USSR architect to participate in this main arena of the Expo 70. I also went to the Russian pavilion, and after I waited I was a very little girl, but I went there. I don't remember it, but yes, and I still have this icon that I bought, my parents bought, so I was very proud of that. After that, I would say that some people researched about the exchange of ideas between metabolists and architects in the USSR or USSR in the 70s. I think that we can see this the traits, the remnants of this exchange in the southern province of the part of this country, I think. So this is more or less what I know about this exchange between the two countries in terms of architecture. But in general, Russia has been a very, very important country to Japan as the source of intelligence and also art, especially from constructivism, is still very big. And I think that Murakami-san is also very much kind of a supporter of this creation and thinking. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. I have more of a personal question. It's curious how you see our city through your eyes. Like, and you talk a lot about constructivism. So, how do you think, from your perspective, constructivism aged? Like, what do you think about? Do you have a favorite place here in Moscow, for example? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I have. This is my, I think, third visit to Moscow, and I always stay here very too short. So I have a very sketchy impression of the city. But for instance, this time I was very surprised to this the massiveness of the public of buildings in the city, in the central part of the city. In America or Europe, they talk about big buildings as a kind of in a negative way. But here, if you come here, you would see this this positive side to being big. And still, I very much support the idea of social condenser. And I think that that continues to be an inspiring concept. And if you look at this the city, then I think that you need to really, leave this very fixed idea of big architecture in the Western sphere. And my favorite building, I would like to go to visit for instance, the building that Confirm, and this in the city, but I still haven't visited because I hear like wonderful stories about it. But I would say the biggest sensation to me was the subway stations. Yes, Katya.
I have a question, actually a very short question. From your lecture, it seems that as if contemporary Japanese architects kind of gave up on the city. Is that a conclusion that one can draw from what you were saying?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's yes and no. For instance, there's growing tendency among younger architects, let's say in the 30s and 40s, to think that they should leave the idea of making your own work, but rather you should switch to working with people to create something new. So they're more into renovating old houses. Of course, we have like growing number of abandoned houses, empty houses getting older and older. So what's the point of building new buildings? So that is to me, it's a kind of simplistic way of thinking. But then, yes, like this big ego, like the architecture with a big capital A is, I think, for sure over. So it's more kind of a relative position. People, as I mentioned, no longer go to Arata Isozaki or big name architects for big public buildings. Of course, there are very few competitions actually. So the irony is that people, like the star architects, have many more buildings of large scale outside of the country than in Japan itself. So this is a very kind of ironical kind of switch in the complication. And so I think that this is a kind of reactionary moment for architectural thinking, and I personally think that architects should be making new creation. And I don't think they should give up an idea on making something new and making new statement, trying to change society, rather than renovating what you already have. But I think in the current economic or kind of mood of Japan being very skeptical about architectural creation, well, that is a fact. More or less leaving this ego performance.
And would you say this participatory approach to architecture has worked in Japan?
Well, we have to see. It's whether because it's I think that you do it outside of the market economy is important, and it's a new attempt in Japan still. So I think we still have to see. Of course, in the case of Sejima, we have to also we should not neglect the fact that it was brought in by the big capital of a publisher. So it is, in a way, it pretends to be outside of the market economy, but because it's thanks to the market economy. But the logic is different from within the market economy. So I think it's time for maybe to really think about what is particular to the Japanese condition in terms of architectural approach. For instance, I think Sejima is probably most struggling to articulate what is actually making her new social engagement is what kind of impact on her own practice of design. And I think at the same time she continues to make a strong statement as an author. But I think the new kind of tendency probably is coming in to release certain part of the author creation to it's a new condition. But so I think it's still kind of ambiguous moment.
Раз, два, три. Thank you very much for
Yes, thank you.
very saturated and informative lecture. And I have a question about maybe not obvious inspirations of Japanese architects, because I know, for example, that Russian constructivism influenced very much to Zaha Hadid, which is not obvious. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about some maybe musical literature, not even Russians, or other historical influences and inspirations of Japanese architects, for Japanese architects.
From Russia.
No, not only from Russia, but in general, maybe some I don't know, something which is not so obvious.
From now or in the past? Well, as far as architecture is concerned, and I think it has always been under the influence of American trends, American pop culture. But also, I would say that still European and even Chinese cultures really make a big part of the inspiration to Japanese architects. As far as the current generations are concerned, I think that, for instance, the musical, the popular music, for instance, is a very important, becoming an important kind of link to, with architects sharing the same kind of mission. For instance, Ali Bao Wow is now working with musicians to kind of reinvigorate the village of the fishing port together. Because musicians, I think they are highly socially motivated people because they're always dealing with this big crowd, I think, at least the popular ones. And so they all more and more they feel this kind of mission to kind of respond, kind of pay back this popularity in something, regardless of income. And then architects, as I explained, share the same agenda. I mean, the similar agenda, but from different motivations. So in a way, it makes sense for them to kind of collaborate. They're motivated to collaborate together. Yes.
Спасибо. Нас, к сожалению, поджимает время, поэтому, наверное, последний вопрос.
Hello, my name is Nina. Thank you for the lecture. I have a question about an architecture who was going to build the city floating in the sea. Why was the project unsuccessful? It was interesting for me. Thank you.
Which project was unsuccessful?
The city floating in the sea. Why was it? Why did he fail?
Why did he fail? Well, I think it's good that he failed. But actually, in 1975, it's not entirely true. I'm sorry, but in 1975, after the oil crisis, was this big expo in Okinawa, the southern part of Japan. He actually realized part of the idea into a floating pavilion for expo. And then, there's an interesting story. So after 1974, came in this Nixon regime in America. And Nixon regime and the Japanese government started to talk about returning this island, which used to be a colony of America, to Japan. And in order to celebrate this return of the island, which actually happened, President Nixon was very interested in realizing, expanding this floating pavilion and in a larger scale. And so actually, of course, the architect was very, very happy with this news and just hoped that it would happen. But then, of course, this Nixon had a scandal, the Watergate scandal. And later, so then this project didn't happen. And then, ironically, no one else was interested in this floating pavilion anymore. And then it was brought to China and scrapped. And so, to zero. So that was the end of the story. But there was, the interesting fact was that the Japanese government was always investing into the development of Kikutaki's idea. So at least for 15 years, the national kind of the budget, the money of the country went into this the development of the idea to make it real, a floating city for Japan, because Japan is surrounded by the water. And actually, it has the longest shoreline. Actually, it's much bigger, longer shoreline than America. And so one time, the Japanese government thought of, what is the best way to utilize the shoreline as a power, as a defense power? And then they came up with this idea, well, maybe, if we develop a floating city, it has lots of merits. For instance, the Okinawa Island has American base, which is a huge controversy still now. And now with this Korean situation is in the center of the political controversy. And of course, it is a huge, it's a big problem for the islanders of Okinawa Island. So I think the island, the floating city in Okinawa would probably help to kind of mitigate this political, the crisis, a dilemma. They can leave the American base to this floating island, for instance. And that was actually seriously discussed for some time. But now they think it is not sustainable.